colleges across the country have come under fire from critics who allege that they've stifled free speech, in effect disrupting thoughtful discourse. But what about universities' strict codes of conduct, with such strong and punitive measures that they risk jeopardizing students' learning ability?
Our next guest is a journalist who profiled a Stanford University student whose hard work of getting into his dream school were dashed soon after he started attending the prestigious college. He went from being a stellar student to racking up multiple incomplete courses and nearly flunking another after being subjected to Stanford's strong punitive measures. Here to further discuss is breaking news reporter for the Des Moines Register, Francesca Block. Welcome, Francesca. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me.
So could you summarize for us briefly this excellent piece of reporting that you've done? Tell us the story in short.
Yes, so this story really centers around a Stanford senior named Decker Palmier. And Decker attended Stanford. It was his dream school. He said it was like the embodiment of the American dream for him. But once he got there, he became the president of his fraternity. He threw a party as president, and then Stanford's disciplinary machine cracked down on him and many other fraternities. And really, Decker's experience, to him, it just showed that all of this work he put in to get into this university, to excel there, he just didn't feel like he was being treated as an adult, being treated with the respect he deserved through that disciplinary process.
You also mentioned, I've paid very close attention to campus, adjudication procedures and how, changing rules have really affected students, not just their free speech rights, but their due process rights. You mentioned in this story another Stanford student, a female athlete who actually, it's horribly, horribly sad, committed suicide after after becoming involved in the adjudication process. Can you mention that? And that one got a little bit of national attention. Can you talk about that too?
Yes. So I believe you're referring to the story of Katie Meyer.
Yeah.
And last year, Katie Meyer, she was a star of the Stanford soccer team. She was a great student. She was an aspiring lawyer. She wanted to go to Stanford Law School. But back in August of 2021, Katie Meyer spilled coffee on another student at Stanford, a football player who she alleged had sexually assaulted her young teammate on the soccer team. And that spilled coffee resulted in a 6-month investigation. And ultimately, at the end of the investigation, Katie Meyer ended up taking her own life with the email open from Stanford's Office of Community Standards on her computer at the time.
Yeah, it's so horrible. So, she was defending her friend, and then she was subject to this investigation, and I believe you reported that the person that at the time she believed was maybe committing a sexual misconduct, like he didn't call for this investigation. He wanted to work it out without any kind of investigation. So, because I've noticed this in so many campus procedures that like the university will sometimes pursue charges or punishment when there's disputes between students, and not just Stanford, but everywhere, even when the students themselves don't think there is any like cause for something to be determined, like that they'll just make it up on their own. They're not calling for the university to like resolve this. But the university takes the position, sometimes because of Title IX, because of federal requirements, that they should, butt in and make everybody's lives worse.
Yeah, so in this case, in Katie Meyer's family's lawsuit that they filed against Stanford after their daughter's death, they did say that football player, he did want to make amends with Katie. He didn't want her to get in trouble. He didn't want this, whatever situation it was, whether it was an accident, whether it was on purpose, he didn't want it to affect the rest of her life. And basically the university still opened an investigation into Katie, and we see what happened after that. But even more than that, I think Katie's parents, they and many other sources that I spoke to throughout this story talked about how these are basic human interactions, sitting people down, apologizing for a situation, a scenario, things like that now the university is so heavily involved in, to the point where it becomes very, very punitive for something that some people see as very basic.
It's so interesting because we're so used to hearing these stories in which you have an accusation of sexual assault, and the way that the Obama administration's Dear Colleague letter set things out, it was very punitive towards young men. They didn't really have a chance to represent themselves or defend themselves in these very sort of kangaroo court situations. And this seems to be sort of almost an opposite situation. Is this the kind of over enthusiastic administrative stuff that you detail in your great piece? Do you see that as a continuation of that Title IX overreach, or do you see it more as a kind of correction now that we're seeing that's going in another direction?
From my reporting in this piece, it's really hard to say. Obviously, I focus much more internally on Stanford, and the Title IX process is a big part of Stanford's disciplinary process, but there's so much more to it. And I think what my reporting shows is that this is really closely connected to the growth of the administrative state at Stanford, to the fact that Stanford has so many administrators compared to its student body, and even more so when it's compared to its faculty. And I think that's really what this piece shows in the end.
Yeah, you have to worry about what kind of students are graduating elite institutions like this one, like Harvard, like Yale, like Columbia, when they're in little surveillance police states, that there's, as you say, more administrators than teachers, and every petty grievance you have with someone, you can go to an administrator and have them investigated. I have to imagine the kind of COVID police state that existed on a lot of campuses has exacerbated this as well. I've covered cases, of kids throwing parties or being unmasked in their own dormitory rooms, and that prompting investigations. Have you seen some of that as well?
Yes. So Stanford's disciplinary process is more than a decade old, and many of the sources who I spoke to for this story told me that they did really see a crackdown start within the last decade, but COVID really accelerated that crackdown. It made it a lot easier for the administration to step in, to add new requirements, new rules, make it more difficult to do things like throw parties, just kind of those basic college activities that students have. So I do think that, based off of conversations with my sources, COVID has played a pretty big role in what's going on at Stanford today.
It's so interesting, Francesca, because I think a lot of people watching this, we're so used to seeing college students behaving in a way that is almost sort of shocking, and then having the administration sort of support them. There was that case with the the judge a couple weeks ago who sort of, came to give this talk and was shouted down in this. I mean, he didn't behave great either, but was very much shouted down in this very violent way by the students, and then the administration sort of backed them up and supported them. And this is sort of the opposite of that. Tell us a little bit of is there a pattern in who they choose to support and who they choose to sort of go after? What did you find?
I think my reporting shows that at Stanford right now, many of the organizations that are under high scrutiny are those organized social organizations. So Greek Life, for example, is an organization that I think in the past has proven to be difficult for many universities to manage. And I think because of that, they have now been placed under this more heightened scrutiny when it comes to campus life and the role that they play in it.
Well, Francesca, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.